He wanted to start a new life and bought an old Victorian mansion surrounded by terrifying rumors. When the family moved in, the house seemed quiet until the father found this in the attic. Subscribe to the channel and make sure to comment where you're watching this video from. The Wilson family arrived at the edge of Newton Falls on a bright afternoon when the air was heavy with the scent of cut grass and the slow hum of distant traffic. The road that led to their new property narrowed into a lane bordered by maples and lilacs, the branches forming a green tunnel above the car. When the trees opened, the house appeared, tall, angular, almost watchful in its stillness. A Victorian mansion, forgotten by time, wrapped in shadows of its own roofline. For a long moment, none of them spoke. They just stared through the windshield, each trying to see the promise beneath the cracked paint and the layers of neglect. It had taken them years to reach this point. Marcus had worked double shifts as an electrician, saving every extra dollar, while Evelyn took evening shifts at the hospital, patching people together as she dreamed of the day they would have a place to call their own. Their son, Jaden, now 14, had spent half his life listening to talk of one day when we have our house, and little Maya, only 8, had drawn it over and over in her school notebooks. Always a house with a porch, a big tree, and light spilling from the windows. When the auction listing appeared, a spacious Victorian on the outskirts of town for a price that seemed like a typo, they could hardly believe it. The paperwork went through faster than expected. The realtor had smiled too brightly and said the previous owners had left rather abruptly. But Marcus had signed anyway. Now, as he stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under his boots, he felt both triumph and unease. Up close, the house was enormous, with ornate wooden trim curling around the windows like old lace. The paint had once been a proud cream color, but now had the soft gray of dust and age. Weeds climbed the steps of the porch, and a broken swing dangled from one rusted chain. Yet, beneath the decay, there was dignity in its bones. The tower on the left wing caught the light and seemed almost to glimmer, like a memory of its former beauty. Evelyn walked beside him, her eyes scanning the details, the thick oak door with its iron knocker, the cracked stained glass window beside it, the ivy crawling up the eastern wall. "It just needs some love," she said quietly, half to herself. Jaden was less convinced. He kicked at a loose stone and muttered something about ghosts, but Maya ran ahead, laughing, her small feet stirring the dust. She twirled on the porch, the boards creaking under her weight, and called back, "It's ours, right? This whole house?" Marcus smiled despite his fatigue. "Yes, sweetheart, it's ours now." The inside smelled of old wood and time. Dust rose in lazy swirls through the sunlight that spilled from the tall windows. Every step echoed. The staircase dominated the hall, its rail polished by generations of hands, though the wood had dulled with age. To the left, a living room opened with a stone fireplace wide enough to fit a man standing upright. To the right, a dining room with faded wallpaper and a chandelier that swayed ever so slightly, as if still moved by the breath of the past. They moved from room to room, exploring like archaeologists. Upstairs, the floors groaned beneath them. In one bedroom, the walls were pale blue beneath the grime, and the faint outlines of children's drawings were still visible on the plaster. In another, sunlight poured through the torn curtains and glinted off a brass bed frame. It was as if someone had left in a hurry, leaving behind only traces of their life. The attic door was nailed shut, and the basement smelled faintly of metal and damp soil. Marcus made a mental note to check both later. For now, there was enough to do just to make the house livable. The neighbors came that evening, one by one, in cautious curiosity. A man from 2 houses down brought a jar of honey from local bees and mentioned, almost apologetically, that nobody had lived in the old Greeley place for decades. An elderly woman from across the street stood at the edge of the walkway, her hands gripping the handle of her cane. She didn't smile. Her eyes, sharp and clouded at once, lingered on the house rather than the family. When Marcus greeted her, she nodded slightly and said, "Old houses remember things. Just make sure you don't listen to what's not meant for you." Then she turned and walked away before he could reply. That night, the family slept in sleeping bags on the floor of the living room. The furniture would come later. For now, it felt like camping inside history. The silence of the house was different from the silence of their apartment. It had depth, a kind of pulse. Now and then, there was the faint pop of settling wood or a whisper of air through the vents. Marcus told himself it was nothing. Old buildings always talk to themselves. Evelyn lay beside him, tracing patterns on his arm, whispering plans for the kitchen, the garden, the children's rooms. Her voice was soft, steady, full of warmth. The future seemed possible again. Over the next week, they began the process of claiming the space as their own. Marcus tested outlets and replaced broken switches. Evelyn scrubbed the kitchen tiles, uncovering a faded mosaic beneath the grime. Jaden helped carry debris to the truck, though his eyes kept drifting to the shadows at the top of the stairs. Maya found a patch of grass behind the porch, where flowers once grew, and planted new seeds there, marking the soil with sticks and string. Each evening, they ate together in the dining room, surrounded by peeling wallpaper and the smell of lemon cleaner, and imagined how it would look when the work was done. But the house had a presence that didn't yield easily. No matter how much light they brought in, there were corners that stayed dim, and no matter how many windows they opened, the air always carried a faint undertone of something. Dust, metal, the hint of ozone after lightning. Marcus noticed small things, the way the same floorboard creaked at exactly the same time each night, even when no one was upstairs, the slight vibration that hummed through the walls when the wind died down. He tried to trace the wiring to map the circuits, but found that some outlets were connected to nothing, and some cables disappeared into the walls, ending nowhere. Evelyn brushed off his unease. "It's an old house," she reminded him. "Everything's interconnected. We just have to get used to it." But sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, she would pause too, her gaze fixed on the empty hallway as though she'd heard something just beyond the edge of sound. The neighbors stopped by less frequently as the days went on. Conversations were brief, polite, unfinished. Whenever Marcus mentioned the history of the house, people would change the subject. The woman across the street was always watching from her window, her curtains barely parted, her face expressionless. By the second weekend, Marcus had repaired most of the lighting downstairs and replaced several sections of rotten flooring. On Sunday morning, while adjusting a ceiling fixture, he noticed a faint draft seeping from the upper landing. Following it, he found himself beneath a small rectangular panel flush with the ceiling, a concealed attic hatch painted over long ago. He made another mental note. He would need to open it eventually, but not yet. There were too many other things to fix. That evening, rain began to fall, steady and rhythmic, drumming on the roof like a heartbeat. The family gathered in the living room again, the fire flickering weakly against the damp air. Jaden was reading, Maya was drawing by candlelight, and Evelyn sat on the floor surrounded by paint samples, debating which color would bring the walls back to life. Marcus leaned back, listening to the sound of the storm, trying to let go of the unease that clung to him. He told himself that this was just the sound of an old house settling under the weather, nothing more. But somewhere above them, beyond the ceiling, there came a faint, irregular thump, like a loose board shifting, or something moving across the attic floor. He froze, listening. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Evelyn didn't seem to notice. Maya hummed softly, lost in her drawing. Marcus forced a smile and stood to throw another log into the fire. "We'll need to check the roof tomorrow," he said, keeping his tone light. "Might be a leak starting." Evelyn nodded absently, her attention on the paint swatches. That night, long after the others had fallen asleep, Marcus lay awake, staring into the darkness. The rain had stopped, but the silence felt heavier now, layered. He could hear his own heartbeat and the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, and then, barely audible, a low murmur that could have been wind or words. He held his breath. The sound faded. He told himself again that it was nothing. Just the house breathing. Just the rhythm of wood and wind. Still, when dawn came, he found himself standing beneath that attic hatch, looking up at it, trying to understand why he felt as though something above them was waiting. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds. The morning smelled of wet grass and earth. From the kitchen, Evelyn's voice drifted through the air, calling him to breakfast. He forced his gaze away from the ceiling and went downstairs. It was just a house, he told himself again, just walls and wires and wood, but deep down, a small, rational part of him knew that some houses don't simply wait for their owners to fix them. They listen first. And somewhere, in the spaces between the walls of the old Victorian, a faint electric vibration pulsed through the hidden cables, almost like a breath held in anticipation. The new life of the Wilson family had begun, and the house was awake. The rain from the previous night had left the morning heavy with moisture, the air thick and clean, carrying the smell of soil and old wood through the open windows. Marcus stood in the hallway, coffee mug in hand, staring once again at the ceiling panel near the landing. The faint seam of the attic hatch seemed to catch the light in a way that almost made it shimmer. He told himself it was nothing more than curiosity, a need to inspect the roof after hearing that thump in the night, but part of him already knew that whatever was up there had been calling to his mind since the moment he first noticed it. The house, with all its quirks and whispers, was not just old. It was layered, a maze of time and secrets built one over another. Evelyn was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself, her hands deep in soapy water, washing the last of the breakfast dishes. The sound of her voice made the house feel gentler, more alive in a way that had nothing to do with its strange noises. Jaden and Maya were outside in the yard, picking up fallen branches from the storm. For the first time in years, the siblings were laughing together without argument, tossing sticks like spears and making up games. That should have brought Marcus peace. Instead, the faint creak above his head pulled his attention back to the ceiling. He fetched a stepladder from the hallway closet, brushed off the cobwebs that clung to it, and placed it under the hatch. The panel had been painted over, its edges sealed by years of dust and neglect. When he pressed gently with his fingers, it didn't budge. He went to the garage, found a flathead screwdriver and worked it into the seam, prying at the stubborn edge until a flake of old paint gave way. The wood groaned faintly, and a slow breath of cool air drifted down, carrying with it the smell of age, dried dust, old insulation, and something faintly metallic, like the inside of a forgotten drawer. He hesitated. Then, gripping the sides of the ladder, he pushed the hatch open. The wood scraped softly as the square of darkness yawned above him. He waited for a moment, listening. Nothing. just the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the wind brushing the eaves outside. He climbed up carefully, one foot after another, until his head rose above the floorboards of the attic. It was darker than he expected. The single small window on the far side was so covered in grime it allowed only a weak greenish light. Dust motes floated through the beam of his flashlight like drifting snow. The air was heavy, unmoving. He pulled himself all the way up and crouched, feeling the boards flex slightly beneath his weight. The space was larger than he thought, stretching the full length of the house, but cluttered. Old furniture covered in yellowing sheets, stacks of cardboard boxes, a wooden rocking chair tilted on its side. He began to explore slowly, brushing dust from each object as he passed. A child's tricycle with rusted handlebars, a pile of newspapers from the early 1960s, a wardrobe filled with moth-eaten coats that crumbled at his touch. Everything seemed ordinary, the kind of forgotten clutter that filled attics everywhere. But as he reached the far end, his flashlight caught the dull gleam of metal beneath a faded blanket. He lifted the fabric carefully. Beneath it sat a large reel-to-reel tape recorder, its reels still threaded with brown magnetic tape. Next to it, stacked neatly in a wooden crate, were dozens of reels, each labeled with precise handwriting. Family, Week 1, Family, Week 2, and so on, all the way up to Week 34. Marcus crouched beside the recorder, his pulse quickening. The machine was old, but he recognized the type, a high-quality model used in studios decades ago. He brushed away the dust from its buttons and dials. The switches were stiff but intact. He noticed that the power cord had been cut cleanly near the plug, as though someone had wanted to ensure it would never be turned on again. The crate of reels was so carefully organized that it almost looked ceremonial, each label written in the same hand, each dated in sequence. He took one of the reels and held it up to the light. The brown tape inside gleamed faintly. There was no smell of mildew or decay. Someone had preserved these with care. He could feel the meticulous intent behind the organization, the deliberate effort to record and archive something domestic perhaps, but also unnerving in its precision. Marcus called down to Evelyn, asking for an extension cord and some tape. She appeared at the bottom of the ladder, squinting up into the gloom. "You're not going to break your neck up there, are you?" she said, half teasing. He smiled faintly, but there was tension in his eyes. "Just checking something. Found some old equipment. Might be worth something." He didn't mention the reels yet. She handed him the cord, and he climbed back up, plugging the cut wire into the extension using electrical tape to hold it in place. The machine came to life with a low hum, the reels twitching slightly. Marcus adjusted the knobs and pressed play. For a few seconds there was only static, a deep, hollow hiss that filled the attic. Then, gradually, sound emerged. Voices, muffled but clear enough to recognize as human. A woman speaking softly, the scrape of a chair, the sound of dishes. The domesticity of it was strangely intimate. He turned the volume down, listening more closely. It was like overhearing a life preserved in amber. A man's voice joined hers, gentle at first. They were discussing dinner plans, laughing. The laughter felt real, familiar. Then the sound of a door opening, footsteps, a child calling out. Marcus sat frozen, the flashlight balanced between his knees, the beam aimed at the far wall. He felt like an intruder. The recording was decades old, yet the immediacy of it made it feel alive. He listened longer. The reel continued with the sounds of the family going about their evening, setting the table, clinking plates, a radio playing softly in the background. Then a shift. An argument began, voices raised, a chair scraping harshly. The woman said something sharp. The man responded with frustration, then silence. After a few seconds, the tape clicked, ended, and the reel stopped spinning. Marcus stared at the machine, a coldness creeping into his chest. He rewound it slightly, pressed play again, and listened to the final seconds, the way the argument trailed off, the faint rustling before the silence. There was no clear reason why this moment had been captured, no sign that the recording had any purpose other than existing. But it was the labels on the other reels that drew his attention. Dozens more weeks, dozens more lives recorded in secret. He carried the machine downstairs, wiping his hands on his jeans. The attic seemed to watch him as he descended, the beam of his flashlight bouncing off the slanted ceiling. Evelyn met him at the bottom, drying her hands on a towel. "What is that thing?" she asked. "Looks ancient." He set the recorder on the dining table. "Old tape machine. And these." He gestured to the crate of reels. "Some kind of recordings. I think the people who lived here before made them." Evelyn frowned. "Home movies?" He shook his head. "No. Audio, conversations, dinners, regular stuff, like someone recorded their entire life." She looked uneasy. "That's strange." He agreed silently. Strange didn't begin to describe it. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Marcus cleaned the machine and tried another reel. This one was labeled Week 12. The same family, the same house, if he judged by the acoustics. He could hear the echo of high ceilings and the faint hum of what must have been the same kitchen fan they now used. But the tone of the voices was different this time. Quieter, edged with tension. The man spoke less, the woman's words were clipped, and in between their conversations there were long, heavy silences. He sat listening as the recording drifted from ordinary talk to something darker. The man mentioned them several times. "They're outside again," he said once, his voice trembling slightly. "I can hear them at night." The woman told him to stop, her voice brittle. "It's just the wind," she said. Then, abruptly, the tape ended again. Marcus felt his pulse in his throat. He played one more reel. Near the end, after another domestic conversation that seemed to dissolve into fear, there was a faint sound, barely audible at first like static, but beneath it, a whisper, a second layer of sound. He turned up the volume. The whisper grew clearer. It wasn't the family's voices. It was deeper, slower, like someone speaking through another line, describing what the family was doing as they did it. "They're eating. The mother is standing. The children are laughing." Marcus felt the hairs on his arms rise. He stopped the tape and stared at the machine. For several minutes he sat in silence, the room heavy around him. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was an accidental recording, radio interference, or a second tape bleeding through, but the cadence, the precision of the words sounded deliberate, observational, like notes taken in real time. He turned off the recorder and carried the crate into the corner, covering it with a sheet. When Evelyn came in, he told her only that the tapes were strange old family stuff, nothing to worry about. She didn't press him, but she looked at him for a long moment, as though she sensed something unsettled beneath his calm tone. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the whispering voice from the tape, flat, a motionless recording. The father is sitting. The mother is folding her hands. He lay awake, listening to the old house breathe. Occasionally, a faint vibration passed through the walls, like a current moving unseen. At one point, the refrigerator clicked on downstairs, and he jumped, his body rigid. When dawn finally arrived, he was already sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the machine. Outside, birds sang. Light spilled gently through the lace curtains, softening the sharp edges of the night. He tried to laugh at himself. Old tapes, old equipment, nothing supernatural about it, and yet, deep inside, he knew what he had heard wasn't static or bleed through. Someone had been listening. In the following days, he would keep returning to that thought. He would tell himself that understanding the recordings might help him make sense of the unease that seemed to have taken root in the house. But even as he went back to his routine, fixing outlets, checking roof leaks, trying to bring the old structure back to life, he found his thoughts drawn to the attic, to the machine that had captured not just the voices of a vanished family, but perhaps the faint echo of whoever had been listening to them. The attic had given him something more than an old machine. It had given him a question that reached far beyond the creaks and murmurs of the old house. Who had been on the other side of those recordings? And why did the labels on the final reels, week 33 and week 34, end so abruptly, with no continuation, no closure, as if the act of recording itself had stopped mid-breath? As evening fell again, Marcus sat by the window, watching the light fade behind the trees. The air carried the smell of rain once more, and far above him, the attic waited in silence, its dusty secrets resting in the dark. The first door had been opened. The house, it seemed, was ready to tell its story, but only to someone willing to listen. The days that followed were filled with a kind of restless energy, as if the house itself had begun to breathe in rhythm with its new inhabitants. The morning light no longer looked as warm as it had on that first day. It filtered through the tall windows in long, dusty beams, revealing every imperfection in the air. Evelyn tried to make the kitchen smell like home, frying bacon and brewing coffee early each morning, while Marcus checked wiring and outlets before leaving for work. He told himself he was only being cautious, making sure the old electrical system didn't pose a fire hazard. But beneath that practical reason lived a smaller, quieter one he didn't share with anyone. He wanted to understand the pattern of the house's heartbeat, the faint, irregular pulses he felt in the floorboards, the clicks and murmurs behind the plaster. The attic discovery lingered in his mind. The tape recorder sat covered with a sheet in the corner of the dining room, but its presence was like a small current in the air, unseen, yet always there. Marcus thought about the whispered voice he had heard describing the family's actions. He had tried to convince himself it was a distortion, the result of interference, but the memory of that steady, observing tone refused to leave him. That morning, after seeing Jaden and Maya off to school, he began tracing the wiring throughout the house. Some outlets were dead, others powered faintly buzzing circuits that led to nowhere. Behind one outlet in the hallway, he found a tangle of thin wires different from the house's electrical lines, older, coated with fabric instead of plastic. They ran upward into the wall and disappeared between the studs. When he followed the line into the living room, it appeared again behind a decorative vent running up toward the ceiling. He felt an odd chill. Whoever had built this wiring hadn't done it for lights or appliances. It was too discreet, too carefully hidden. Evelyn joined him, wiping her hands on a dish towel, watching with faint worry as he knelt by the baseboard. "You're not going to tear the walls open, are you?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "No, just checking something." She didn't ask what. Her silence was both understanding and avoidance. There were moments now when she seemed to sense that he was chasing something intangible, and perhaps she didn't want to know what it was. That night, the house grew louder. Rain lashed the windows again, and the wind moaned through the chimney like a voice caught between floors. As they sat together in the living room, the fireplace crackling weakly, Jaden complained that the phone in the hallway made a faint popping sound every few minutes, even when no one used it. Marcus rose to check it, lifting the receiver. The line hissed faintly, then gave a short series of soft clicks, rhythmic and deliberate, before going silent. He replaced it slowly, forcing a smile. "Just static," he said, though he wasn't sure. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Evelyn tried to read, but kept losing her place. The fire had burned low, leaving the room half in shadow. Marcus stood by the staircase, staring up into the darkness above. "It's an old house," she reminded him softly, echoing her earlier words. He nodded but didn't move. He thought he could hear something faint above, the scrape of a loose board or perhaps footsteps pacing across the attic floor. Sleep came fitfully. Near midnight, he awoke to the faint hum of the radio in the kitchen. It was tuned to no station, just a low, static drone, punctuated by short bursts of sound, half words, half breaths. He walked through the hallway barefoot, the floor cold beneath him. The kitchen was dark except for the faint orange glow of the dial. When he turned the knob to shut it off, the static seemed to resist for a moment before fading. He stood there in the dark for a long time, the silence heavier than before, as though something unseen was listening back. In the morning, he didn't mention it. He fixed the leaky faucet instead, replaced another outlet, and told Evelyn he might check the basement wiring next. She nodded absently, tying her hair back before heading to work. But as she passed the phone in the hallway, she paused, frowning slightly at it before walking on. By afternoon, the sound returned, those faint, almost imperceptible clicks through the line, like distant fingers tapping glass. Marcus picked up the receiver again and listened. For a moment, there was nothing, and then, faintly, a whispering pattern, like breath pressed against a microphone. "Can you hear?" The words were so quiet he couldn't be sure they were real. He hung up, the receiver slick in his palm. He spent the next hour following the strange wires from room to room, unscrewing outlet covers, tracing where each line vanished into the walls. In the study, behind a built-in bookcase, he discovered a narrow gap that revealed the same type of cable threaded upward. It led toward the ceiling and then deeper into the walls. He tapped along the paneling and felt a hollow resonance near the corner. It was as if the house's skeleton had cavities filled with unseen veins, each carrying something more than electricity. That evening, he returned to the attic and played another tape. The sound crackled to life. Rain again, muffled through windows, the clinking of silverware. The same family's voices emerged, gentle, nervous, tired. The woman's tone carried strain now. "I heard it again," she said softly. The man replied, "Don't start." A long pause followed, broken only by the ticking of a clock. Then the voice came. The same deep, detached one Marcus had heard before, distant but distinct. "They are speaking quietly now. The mother looks afraid." Marcus stopped the tape. The silence that followed was immense. He sat in the half-light of the attic, staring at the recorder, unable to move. That voice did not belong to the family. It was an observer, narrating, cataloging, watching from somewhere beyond the edge of their awareness. He went downstairs and poured himself a glass of water. His hands trembled slightly. The walls of the house seemed to hold their breath around him. Down the hall, the refrigerator buzzed, then stopped, leaving behind the faint echo of something mechanical, like a switch being flipped somewhere far away. When Evelyn came home later, he said nothing about the tapes. She talked about her day, about a patient who had brought her flowers, about the kids' school forms she needed him to sign. Her words filled the air like a lifeline, but his thoughts kept drifting to the wires, the clicks, the whisper. That night, as they were preparing for bed, Jaden appeared at the door, rubbing his eyes. "Dad," he said quietly, "I heard someone walking in the walls." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. "Probably just mice," he managed to say, though he already knew it wasn't. After Jaden left, he sat on the edge of the bed, listening. For a long time, there was nothing. Then came the faintest creak, like pressure shifting behind the plaster. In the following days, the sounds became more frequent. Sometimes it was the phone, sometimes it was a faint tapping in the vents, rhythmic, deliberate. Once, while Marcus was repairing a kitchen outlet, he thought he heard a voice murmuring from behind the wall, so soft it could have been imagined. He froze, the screwdriver in his hand, his heart pounding. The voice stopped when he leaned closer. He opened the outlet plate and found nothing but dust. Evelyn began to notice the tension in him. "You're working too much," she said one evening. "You need rest." But rest was impossible. Each night the same cycle repeated. The clicks, the creaks, the faint whisper through the wires. It was as if the house was running on a second current, one meant for something other than light or sound. On Sunday, while replacing a faulty switch in the basement, Marcus noticed something strange, a cluster of wires branching away from the main circuit, vanishing behind the concrete wall near an old shelving unit. He moved the shelves aside and saw a thin line of discoloration in the cement, a faint vertical seam. He brushed away the dust and realized it was not solid concrete at all, but plastered wood. There was something behind it. He didn't tell anyone that night. Instead, he stood for a long while in the basement, staring at the seam, the light bulb above him flickering slightly. The faint vibration of the house seemed strongest there, pulsing through the floor. It wasn't random. It had rhythm. When he went back upstairs, the house felt different, alert, aware. The children were asleep. Evelyn was reading in bed, but he felt the presence of something just beyond reach, as though a breath hung suspended behind every wall. He sat at the dining table, the covered recorder beside him, and listened to the quiet until even the quiet began to sound like movement. Outside, the wind rose, brushing against the eaves, making the window panes tremble. Somewhere, deep within the walls, came a soft, almost polite sound, like a switch being turned on again, and Marcus knew that whatever system had once been wired through this house had never really been shut off. It was waiting, patient, listening still. The next morning began in uneasy silence. Evelyn woke first, padding softly through the hallway, pausing at the stairs as if the air itself felt heavier than it had the day before. The light through the windows carried a pale, washed-out hue, as if even the sun hesitated to enter the old house. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, already dressed, a cup of coffee untouched before him. He hadn't slept. The circles beneath his eyes were darker now, and his hands were clasped tightly, as though the act of keeping them still required deliberate effort. When Evelyn asked whether he was all right, he nodded quickly, too quickly, and muttered something about checking the basement wiring again. She wanted to argue, to tell him to leave the house for a few hours, but something in his expression, something focused, almost brittle, made her stop. The memory of the faint seam in the basement wall had kept him awake. It had not been an illusion. The wires leading toward it were real, and the faint rhythmic hum that passed through the floor seemed to originate from that exact part of the house. After breakfast, when the children had gone off to school, Marcus gathered his tools and descended the basement steps. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying the faint smell of earth and iron. The single bulb above the stairs flickered slightly as he reached the bottom. The basement was a strange place, older than the rest of the house. The floor was uneven, half concrete, half compacted dirt. The walls were patched in different materials, some brick, some wood, some plastered in a way that looked more like concealment than repair. The shelves that had once covered the seam stood empty now, pushed aside the night before. Marcus ran his hand over the surface. The plaster felt softer here, less solid, as though hollow behind the layer. He tapped gently with the handle of a screwdriver. The sound echoed differently, muted, distant, like a small chamber beyond. He stood still, listening. The house above him groaned faintly, but beneath that there was another sound, so subtle it might have been his imagination, a low vibration, irregular yet constant. He placed his palm flat against the wall. The faintest tremor answered him as though something on the other side was humming, pulsing faintly with an old, tired rhythm. He hesitated for a long while before deciding to break through. Part of him feared what he might find, and another part feared what it would mean if he found nothing at all. Fetching a small chisel and hammer, he began carefully tapping away at the plaster. The first cracks spread slowly, releasing a small cloud of gray dust that hung in the beam of light like smoke. He coughed, wiped his mouth, and continued. With each strike, the sound changed. First a dull thud, then a hollow, open knock. When he cleared enough to see wood beneath the plaster, he realized the wall concealed a door. The door was narrow, built from thick wooden boards reinforced with metal bands. It had no knob, only a sliding bolt and a small latch, both rusted with age. He brushed off the dust, hesitating again. Someone had gone to great effort to hide this space. The idea that it had remained sealed through all these years unsettled him deeply. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the latch and pulled. The bolt resisted, then shifted with a sharp metallic groan that echoed through the basement. The air that seeped out from the gap was colder, denser, carrying the scent of dust, oil, and something else, an old, faint tang of ozone. Marcus switched on his flashlight and stepped through. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow room about 10 feet long, with low ceilings and walls covered in soundproofing material, old layers of padded fabric, yellowed and fraying. The air inside was still, heavy with decades of neglect. A single chair stood in the center, and beside it, a small desk cluttered with relics of forgotten technology. Rotary dials, tangled wires, glass tubes, reels of magnetic tape, all coated in a fine layer of dust. The walls were lined with panels that had once held microphones, small circular mounts embedded in the insulation, their wires still running upward into the ceiling. He felt a chill run through him as he realized what this was. A listening room, not for music, not for radio, for observation. Someone had been recording and monitoring the sounds of the house from here. The tapes in the attic, the faint wires hidden in the walls, the rhythmic hum, everything connected back to this place. On the desk, beneath the dust, lay a thick notebook bound in leather. He brushed it off carefully, feeling the stiff crackle of its spine as he opened it. The first page was neat, written in a precise hand, with dates running down the margins. Subject A. Morning activity recorded. Breakfast, reading newspaper. Subject B. Cleaning. Mild irritation with Subject A. The next entry continued without emotion. simply recording daily life as though it were a scientific study. The handwriting remained calm, detached, unfeeling. The entries stretched across months, each noting minor behavioral details: tone of voice, sleep patterns, emotional states. The later pages became darker in content. Subject A displays anxiety. Mentions of being watched recurring. Children restless at night. Possible discovery of observation system. Continue recording discreetly. At the end of the journal, the handwriting changed slightly, as if written in haste. The last entry read, "Subjects become unaware. Relocation imminent. Equipment left operational for long-term monitoring. Observation to continue without interference." Marcus closed the book slowly, his hand trembling. On the floor beside the desk lay a stack of photographs. The top one showed a man, woman, and 2 children sitting at a dinner table, the same family whose voices he had heard on the tapes. The images looked like they'd been taken from odd angles, through doorways, between stair railings, even through small slits in the wall. In one photograph, the mother's face was turned directly toward the camera, her eyes wide as though she had just realized she was being watched. He felt a wave of nausea and backed away from the desk. The flashlight beam trembled as he raised it toward the corner of the room. There, behind a panel of soundproofing, was a cluster of small amplifiers and what appeared to be a network of wires branching upward. They vanished through holes in the ceiling, no doubt connecting to the hidden microphones in the attic's recorder. The entire house had been wired to feed into this single room, a heart of surveillance, still and silent now, yet somehow not entirely dead. He turned to leave, but something on the far wall caught his attention. Etched faintly into the soundproof padding were lines of handwriting, written in pencil, shaky and uneven. He moved closer and read them under the flashlight's beam. "They hear us. We are not alone in this house. They said we are part of the study, but no one ever came to end it." The last message was nearly illegible, pressed so hard into the padding that it tore slightly. "If someone finds this, turn it off." Marcus stepped back, heart hammering. He turned towards the door, but before leaving, his light swept across the table again, catching the edge of a small metal box half hidden beneath old paper. He lifted it and found a reel of tape inside, smaller than the others, labeled only with the words "Control Line, Final." He pocketed it without thinking, shut the door, and returned upstairs. The rest of the day passed in a kind of haze. He told Evelyn only that he had found an old storage space, not wanting to alarm her. She looked relieved to see him come up from the basement covered in dust but alive, though there was still a question in her eyes she didn't voice. That evening, when the children were in bed and the house had settled into its usual symphony of faint creaks and hums, Marcus sat alone in the living room, the small tape in his hand. He connected it to the old recorder and pressed play. At first, there was nothing but static, a faint irregular hiss that rose and fell. Then came the sound of footsteps, a door opening, and a man's voice, shaky, low, but unmistakably the same as the one he'd heard before in the family's recordings. "I know you can hear me," the voice said. "Whoever you are, I can hear you, too. In the walls. I can hear you moving." There was a long pause, and then a different voice, calm, unfamiliar, replied, "Observation will continue. Please remain cooperative." A sharp crash followed, then silence, then the faint hum of machinery. The recording ended abruptly, leaving a void that filled the room. Marcus sat still, unable to move for several minutes. His breath came shallowly, the echo of the last words still pressing against his mind. He looked around the room, suddenly aware of every vent, every wall, every silent space where sound might travel unseen. Somewhere above him, a floorboard shifted, as if answering. He didn't play the tape again. Instead, he hid it in a drawer and walked quietly through the house, touching the walls as he passed. The vibrations were subtle but constant now, as though the house had awakened. He paused by the phone in the hallway. The line gave its faint double click, the one he had come to dread. He didn't pick it up. He already knew there would be no one on the other end. That night, as Evelyn slept beside him, Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed down on him with suffocating certainty. The family from the tapes had been real, their fear justified. The project, whatever it had been, had turned their home into a cage of observation. And if the note on the wall had been right, if no one had ever come to turn it off, then perhaps the system still listened, even now, decades later. He rose before dawn, unable to bear the silence any longer, and went to the basement once more. The air felt different this time, colder, more deliberate, as though aware of his presence. He stood before the sealed room, his hand resting on the latch. He didn't open it again. Not yet. But he could hear it now, faintly, beneath the layers of wood and plaster. The soft, almost human hum of machinery still alive. It came in measured intervals like breath. The house seemed to be waiting. The discovery of the hidden room changed everything. The house no longer felt like a project or a home, but a labyrinth of buried intentions. Marcus could not enter the basement without feeling as though he were descending into someone else's memory, into the architecture of surveillance and control that had once pulsed with unseen electricity. He told himself that knowing the truth was a way to reclaim the space, to strip away its mystery. But every new answer only deepened the unease. The journal's detached handwriting, the listening devices, the photographs of the vanished family. Each piece pointed towards something deliberate, organized, and far beyond anything that could be dismissed as eccentricity. For days, Marcus avoided the basement. He worked upstairs, fixing the creaking steps, resealing the windows, replacing light bulbs that burned out faster than they should have. Yet, even as he worked, he felt the weight of what lay below, as though the hidden room breathed in time with the house itself. Sometimes, while hammering nails into the wall, the vibrations seemed to echo back, faint and delayed, as if the walls were answering. Evelyn noticed the change in him. He was quieter now, speaking less during meals, often staring off into some thought he wouldn't share. When she asked if he was still hearing things, he said no, but the lie hung between them like the dust that floated endlessly in the afternoon light. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Evelyn sat across from him at the table and said, "You're somewhere else lately. If this house is too much, we can leave. It doesn't have to be perfect." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot, and for a long moment he didn't answer. Finally, he said, "I just need to understand it. Once I know what happened, it won't have power over us anymore." But even as he said it, he knew that understanding might never bring peace. The next morning, he drove into town to visit the public library. Newton Falls was a quiet place, and had streets lined with small shops and faded brick buildings that spoke of better decades. The library itself was an old structure of red stone and marble floors, its air cool and dry with the scent of paper and binding glue. Behind the front desk sat an elderly archivist named Meister Kessler, who had worked there for more than 40 years. Marcus introduced himself and explained that he had bought the old Greeley property. At the mention of the name, Kessler's brows lifted slightly, but he said nothing for a long time, only adjusting his glasses and motioning for Marcus to follow. In a back room filled with filing cabinets and microfilm readers, Kessler pulled a stack of folders from a lower drawer. "We don't get many people asking about that house," he said quietly. "It's older than most places here, built around 1890, but the part that might interest you is from the 60s. There was a program, a research initiative, something to do with domestic psychology." He set the folders on the table, the thin paper rustling softly. Marcus began to read. The documents were sparse, but the story they told was unmistakable. A federal agency had funded a project known as the Behavioral Home Study, intended to analyze interpersonal dynamics within controlled domestic environments. Several houses across the country had been outfitted with observation equipment, hidden microphones, cameras, and audio recorders. Families were selected under the guise of sociological research and were told they would be compensated for participation. According to the official language, the goal was to observe authentic, unprompted domestic behavior. As he turned the pages, Marcus's throat tightened. The reports were dry, clinical, their language free of emotion. They listed test subjects by number, not by name. Each file contained summaries of recorded behavior, mood changes, deviations from normal activity. But then the reports stopped abruptly. The final document, dated late 1964, mentioned a disruption of subject integrity and the termination of further data collection. There was no explanation, no follow-up, no closure. "Was there an investigation?" Marcus asked. Kessler shook his head. "Not here. The files went federal after that. The local paper ran a few pieces, but they disappeared quickly. People in town stopped talking about it." He hesitated, then added, "The family living there then, John and Margaret Hill, I believe, just vanished. The authorities wrote it off as a disappearance, but there was no sign of travel, no vehicle gone, nothing. They left everything behind. Even dinner plates were still on the table when the sheriff came." Marcus sat in silence, staring at the faded ink. The weight of history pressed down on him like a physical thing. He could see it all in his mind, the family in those recordings, slowly realizing that their home was not their own, their private lives dissected for someone's study. The whispers in the walls were not madness. They were echoes of what had been done to them. Before leaving, he asked if he could copy the documents. Kessler nodded, running the pages through the machine, the faint smell of warm toner filling the air. "Be careful with what you find," the old man said as Marcus gathered the papers. "Some truths don't set you free. They just change what you thought freedom was." When Marcus returned home, the afternoon light had already begun to fade. Evelyn met him at the door, relief in her eyes. "You were gone all day," she said. "I was starting to worry." He told her where he'd been, showed her the copies, but left out the part about the vanished family. She read through the pages in silence, her fingers trembling slightly at the government letterhead. "They watched people in their own homes?" she whispered. "That's insane." He nodded. "It was supposed to be for science, but it went wrong. The family they studied here, something happened to them. No one ever said what. They sat together at the kitchen table long after the children had gone to sleep, the papers spread between them like a map of betrayal. The house around them seemed to shift with the wind, its walls flexing faintly as if straining to listen. Evelyn looked up, her voice small. "If this was part of an experiment, why does it feel like it never stopped?" Marcus couldn't answer. He reached out and took her hand, but his mind was already turning, tracing the connections between what he'd read and what he'd seen in the basement. The monitoring system, the wires, the journal entries, it all fit the structure of a controlled observation. But one thing didn't fit. Why was the equipment still functioning after all these years? Someone had to have maintained it at some point. The next day, he went back into the hidden room. The air was colder than before, and a thin film of dust had settled again on the desk. He knelt beside the old amplifiers and opened one of the panels. Inside, the components were ancient. Vacuum tubes, resistors, and hand-soldered joints, but a few of the wires were newer, their plastic insulation uncracked. Someone had tampered with the system within the last few decades. He followed the newer wires as they snaked along the wall, up toward the ceiling, and disappeared into a hole that led to the living room floor above. A sinking realization spread through him. The observation network had not been abandoned. It had been quietly sustained, hidden beneath coats of paint and new fixtures, feeding its silent purpose while the world moved on. Whether anyone was still listening now, he couldn't be sure, but the possibility was enough to make him feel watched at every turn. He spent that evening trying to disconnect the cables, severing the lines he could reach. The house reacted as if in protest. Lights flickered, faint popping noises echoed in the vents, and the refrigerator gave a deep, shuddering hum that seemed too deliberate to be mechanical. Evelyn begged him to stop, her voice trembling, but he didn't listen. By the time he cut the final wire leading from the hidden room, the basement light bulb exploded with a sharp crack, plunging him into darkness. When he climbed back upstairs, his hands shaking, the house was eerily still. The phone line was dead. The air felt heavy, charged. He stood in the hallway, listening. Nothing. Only the sound of his own breathing. He wanted to believe that it was over, that he had broken whatever network bound the house to its past. But as he turned off the last lamp and headed to bed, he thought he could hear something faint behind the walls, a sound not unlike the whirring of tape reels beginning to turn. Sleep refused to come. The next morning, the phone line was working again. When Evelyn lifted the receiver, she heard a faint click on the line followed by a soft, steady breathing. She hung up immediately, her face pale. Marcus said nothing, but his eyes darkened with recognition. He had heard that same breath before, on the tapes, in the voice that had narrated the family's lives. That afternoon, a police car pulled into their driveway. The officer, a middle-aged man with a kind face, introduced himself as Detective Harper. "We got your call," he said, nodding toward Marcus. "You mentioned finding evidence of illegal surveillance equipment in your home." Marcus led him down to the basement, explaining everything: the hidden room, the journal, the photographs, the recordings. Harper listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When Marcus opened the door to the room, the officer stepped inside, shining his flashlight across the walls. The soundproofing, the equipment, the notebook, all were there, just as Marcus had described. Harper took a few photographs and promised to file a report, but before leaving, he paused at the foot of the stairs. "You said the equipment still works?" "I think it does," Marcus said. "It was humming when I found it. Some of the wiring looked newer." Harper nodded slowly. "I'll have someone from the state look at it. But don't expect quick answers. Stuff like this, especially old federal projects, has a way of getting lost in the paperwork." After he left, Marcus felt no relief. The words "getting lost" echoed in his head, an admission that the truth might never surface. He knew the police report would vanish into the same bureaucratic void as the original experiment. He could almost feel the indifference of the decades pressing down on him. That night, after Evelyn and the children had gone to bed, he sat in the kitchen, the copies of the government documents spread before him. The pages rustled faintly in the breeze from the open window. He read them again, slower this time, looking for patterns, hidden meanings, anything he might have missed. And there, in the margin of one of the later pages, faint and handwritten, were 2 words: Observation continues. The ink was darker than the rest, added long after the original report had been typed. He stared at the phrase until the lines of the letters blurred. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees. Somewhere, deep in the house, the faint hum returned, pulsing through the floorboards like a slow heartbeat. Marcus sat perfectly still, the papers trembling in his hands. He realized with terrible certainty that the experiment had never truly ended. It had only changed subjects. When dawn came, he closed the windows and locked the doors. He couldn't bear the thought of leaving, not yet. Not until he understood who was still listening. The truth had finally revealed itself, but it was not the comfort he'd hoped for. It was a presence, invisible and endless, woven into the bones of the house. And now, as he walked through its quiet rooms, he felt it moving with him, recording, observing, continuing its work exactly as it had always done. The day after the police visit began with the kind of brittle calm that never lasts. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break it. The walls were too still, the air too quiet, as if even the wind outside had stopped to listen. Marcus sat at the kitchen table long after sunrise, a half-eaten slice of toast on his plate, the newspaper untouched beside it. He stared at nothing, his mind repeating the same words over and over. Observation continues. It was no longer a theory or a metaphor. It was fact. The house was alive in a way that defied reason, and the machinery of surveillance, however old or hidden, was still functioning. It wasn't about ghosts or superstition. It was about men, their systems, and their silence. Evelyn tried to distract him with talk of ordinary things, the grocery list, the children's upcoming school recital, the idea of repainting the living room, but every word she spoke sounded like static in his ears. She could see he wasn't really there. The papers he had brought back from the library remained spread across the dining table, their corners curling from the night air. Every time she passed them, she felt an irrational urge to burn them, to destroy the paper trail that seemed to keep her husband tethered to something dark. But she knew he would never allow it. He was too deep now, drawn into the current of a truth that had no exit. By afternoon, Detective Harper returned. The sound of his car crunching on the gravel jolted Evelyn out of her uneasy rhythm. Marcus met him at the door, his expression tense. Harper stepped inside, nodding and greeting, his hat tucked under his arm. He moved with the quiet assurance of someone used to bad news. "I sent a report to the state lab," he said. "They'll want to send someone out to take a look at the equipment you found. But between you and me, I wouldn't hold your breath. These things take time. Old files, federal involvement, it gets complicated." "Did you find anything?" Marcus asked. His voice was low, but the desperation in it was unmistakable. Harper hesitated, then said, "I did some digging. There was indeed a federal program matching the details you described. Behavioral observation, family dynamics under stress, stuff that sounds almost unbelievable now. The file's been classified for decades, but I did find one odd thing. The property wasn't officially listed as decommissioned like the others. It was marked as ongoing research asset." The words landed like a blow. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Ongoing, he repeated. As in, still active? Harper raised a hand. Could be a clerical error. Could mean anything. I just thought you'd want to know. They went down to the basement together. The officer crouched near the equipment, flashlight sweeping over the dust-covered panels. He tapped one of the boxes with his knuckle, listening to the hollow echo. It's old, that's for sure, he said, but the wiring's newer in spots, like you mentioned. Someone might have been down here after the original installation. He stood, brushing off his knees. I'll make sure they test everything properly. Marcus followed him up the stairs, watching the man's face for any sign of understanding. Detective, he said quietly before Harper left, if you thought someone was still listening, what would you do? Harper paused at the door, his hand on the knob. I'd stop talking to myself, he said with a weary half-smile. Then he stepped out into the sunlight, leaving Marcus alone with the echo of his words. That night, the unease reached its breaking point. Around midnight, the family was startled awake by a loud pop somewhere in the walls, followed by a low hum that spread through the house like a tremor. The lights flickered, the air seemed to vibrate, and from the kitchen came the sharp click of the phone receiver lifting itself off the hook. Marcus was out of bed in an instant, racing down the stairs. The phone hung in the air, its cord twisting gently, emitting a faint rhythmic static. He grabbed it, pressed it to his ear, and froze. There was no voice, only the sound of breathing, slow and deliberate. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice shaken. The breathing stopped. Then came a soft, unmistakable whisper. Subject A, still present. The line went dead. He stood in the hallway for what felt like hours, his heart hammering in his chest. When he finally turned, Evelyn was standing on the stairs, pale in the dim light. "What was it?" she asked. He couldn't bring himself to answer. Instead, he walked to the breaker panel and shut off the main power. The house fell into silence so complete it made their ears ring. In the days that followed, Marcus tried to involve himself in ordinary work again, but the world outside the house no longer seemed real. Every sound felt like part of a pattern, every shadow like a presence. He caught himself listening for the hum behind the walls, half hoping it would be gone, half afraid it would be silent. Evelyn began taking the children out during the day, to the park, the library, anywhere that wasn't inside those listening walls. The distance between them widened, each afraid to admit what they felt, that the house was not just observing them, but learning from them. One evening, as the sky turned red with sunset, Marcus decided to document everything. If no one believed him, he would create a record that could not be ignored. He retrieved an old cassette recorder from his workshop and began speaking softly into the microphone, describing each event in detail: the tapes, the hidden room, the phone calls, the voice. He worked late into the night, his words measured but trembling. When he played the tape back, however, the recording was distorted. Beneath his own voice was another, faint but constant, speaking just out of sync. He rewound, pressed play again, and listened closely. It was repeating his words almost perfectly, a half-second delay between each. Marcus shut the machine off and sat in the dark, the blood pounding in his temples. The echo was too precise to be accidental. Whatever it was listening wasn't just recording. It was responding, reflecting, adapting. The next morning, Harper returned again, this time with another man, a technician carrying a heavy case of instruments. They spent several hours in the basement, testing voltages, mapping connections, photographing everything. Marcus waited upstairs, pacing. When they emerged, the technician's expression was tight, professional, unreadable. "We'll need to take some of this equipment in for analysis," he said. "It's unusual, but nothing's active as far as we can tell." Marcus frowned. "It was active last night. You didn't hear the hum?" The man shook his head. "These systems don't power themselves, sir. They require an external source. Maybe you heard the furnace cycling." Marcus wanted to argue, but Harper gave him a look, a silent plea to let it rest. They loaded the smaller devices into the car and left, promising updates that never came. For a brief moment, life almost seemed to normalize. The house was quiet again. The phone stopped clicking. The lights remained steady. Marcus even began to believe it might finally be over. He and Evelyn sat together on the porch one evening, watching the children chase fireflies across the lawn. The warm air smelled of honeysuckle and earth. For the first time in weeks, she laughed. "Maybe it's finally asleep," she said. Marcus smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe," he said softly. That night, he awoke to a faint vibration in the mattress. At first, he thought it was a dream. Then he realized it wasn't coming from the bed. It was coming from below, through the floorboards. He slipped out of bed and padded down the hallway, the darkness pressing close around him. The vibration grew stronger as he reached the stairs, accompanied by a faint mechanical whirring. It was coming from the basement. When he reached the bottom step, he saw light seeping from the crack beneath the hidden room's door. A thin, steady glow, yellow and unnatural. His pulse quickened. He had cut every wire days ago. There was no power feed in that room. Yet something was running inside it. He hesitated, then grasped the latch and pulled the door open. The sound hit him first, a low, pulsing hum, deep enough to vibrate in his chest. The equipment was alive again. The amplifiers glowed faintly, their vacuum tubes lit like small hearts beating in the dark. On the desk, the old reel-to-reel recorder turned slowly, its reels spinning though no tape was loaded. The voice that came from its speaker was faint but distinct, a series of mechanical clicks that resolved into words. Observation resumed. Marcus stumbled back. His breath caught in his throat. He reached for the breaker switch but stopped midway. The rational part of him screamed to pull it, to end this madness, but another part, darker and more curious, wanted to hear more. The voice continued, calm and detached. Subject A exhibiting heightened stress. Family cohesion declining. External interference documented. Adjusting parameters. Then the light flickered and the sound stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. He turned and bolted upstairs, locking the basement door behind him. His hands shook as he leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. From the top of the stairs, Evelyn's voice came softly, frightened. "Marcus? What is it?" He looked up at her, eyes wild, unable to speak. She descended halfway, her robe trailing on the steps. "Tell me." "The system's still running," he said hoarsely. "They're still watching. They never stopped." The days that followed blurred together. The police didn't return. The technician's number went unanswered. Even Harper's calls went straight to voicemail. The hum beneath the floor came and went, faint but undeniable. The recorder in the living room began turning itself on at random, the tapes inside clicking and spinning though they were blank. And once, while passing the hallway mirror, Marcus thought he saw movement behind his reflection, shadows flickering just beyond the edge of sight. Evelyn began packing quietly, folding clothes into suitcases late at night when she thought he wasn't watching. She wanted to take the children and leave, but Marcus insisted they wait. "If we go now," he said, "we'll never know the truth." His voice had changed, lower and more distant. It wasn't obsession anymore. It was something closer to surrender. One evening, when Evelyn and the children were asleep, Marcus sat alone in the living room, the faint hum vibrating through the floorboards. He turned on the old tape machine from the attic and pressed record. "This is Marcus Wilson," he said, his voice steady now. "I know you're listening. You've been listening all along. But I want you to understand something. You can record everything we say and do, but you can't erase us. We're not your subjects." He paused, the silence stretching. Then came a quiet reply, not from the machine, but from the vent above his head. "All subjects say that." The lights flickered. The machine stopped. The house exhaled a deep, slow sigh as if acknowledging him. When Evelyn woke the next morning, Marcus was gone. The basement door stood ajar, a faint smell of ozone drifting upward. The house was silent again, its heart still, its systems dormant. She called for him, her voice breaking the quiet, but there was no answer, only the soft, almost imperceptible echo of her words repeating from somewhere deep within the walls. By the time Detective Harper arrived 2 days later, the house had returned to its calm facade. He searched the property, found nothing unusual, and filed the report under missing person. Before leaving, he paused by the telephone in the hallway, listening to the faint hum on the line. Then, without a word, he replaced the receiver. As night fell, the house settled into its familiar rhythm. The lights dimmed one by one. The air thickened with stillness, and in the basement, behind the sealed door, a single red indicator light flickered to life. The recorder clicked once, twice, then began to spin. A new label rested on the first reel of tape. Subject B, Initial Observation. And in the quiet above, the house began to listen again. The morning light was pale and indifferent when Evelyn finally stepped outside. She hadn't slept in 2 nights, and her body moved as if detached from her own will, her every motion slowed by a heavy, invisible resistance. The wind carried the scent of wet grass and dust, the smell of the yard after a storm. It was the same house, the same stillness, but everything around her now felt foreign, stripped of warmth. The front porch boards creaked beneath her weight, and for a moment she imagined the sound of Marcus's boots behind her, the familiar rhythm of his steps coming up from the basement. But there was nothing. Only silence, spreading across the property like a veil. She had searched every room twice. His tools still lay neatly arranged in the workshop, the hammer on top of the folded tarp just as he had left it. His cup of coffee was still half full on the kitchen table, a thin film forming over its surface. The children asked where he'd gone, and Evelyn could only say he had gone to find something, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. She didn't tell them about the open basement door or the faint smell of electricity that lingered in the air that morning. She didn't tell them that when she called his name into the dark stairwell, the echo that came back wasn't quite her own voice. Detective Harper had returned briefly the day after Marcus vanished. He had moved with the same quiet caution as before, his eyes scanning the walls as though he, too, felt the weight of their silent attention. He asked his questions, when she'd last seen Marcus, whether he'd left a note, whether anything seemed out of place, but he didn't need to ask if she believed her husband had simply walked away. He could see it in her face, in the way her voice faltered when she mentioned the basement. The officer had searched every corner, shining his flashlight into empty closets, behind furniture, under the porch. When he opened the basement door, He stood there for a long time, looking into the darkness below, as though something in him warned not to descend too far. When he left, he promised to keep the file open, though his tone betrayed no real hope. Missing persons were hard enough when there were witnesses or evidence, but when a man simply disappeared into the silence of his own house, there was little the law could do. Evelyn watched his car drive away until it was gone from sight. Then she turned back toward the house, her reflection faint in the front window. For a moment, she thought she saw movement behind the glass, a brief, flickering shadow near the hallway, but when she stepped closer, it was gone. In the following days, the rhythm of the house settled into something eerily calm. The hum that had once pulsed beneath the floorboards was gone, or perhaps simply quieter, hiding beneath the noises of daily life. The children returned to their routines, as children do, their resilience both a comfort and a quiet agony to their mother. Evelyn cooked, cleaned, and tried to anchor herself in routine, though every sound in the house now carried a double meaning. The tick of the kitchen clock seemed slightly offbeat. The phone gave a soft click each time she walked past it, as if reacting to her presence. She told herself she was imagining it, that the exhaustion was twisting her perception, but deep down she knew the difference between her own thoughts and the subtle, waiting intelligence that lingered in those walls. One evening, after putting the children to bed, she found herself standing in the basement doorway again. The air rising from below was cool and dry, carrying that faint metallic tang she had come to dread. The light switch didn't work. Marcus had cut the power again before he vanished, and so she lit a candle and began to descend. The flame flickered wildly as she reached the bottom step. The shelves of tools and jars of nails cast strange shadows that twisted across the walls. She paused in front of the door to the hidden room. The latch was half closed, not fully locked. She hesitated. Every instinct told her to leave it shut, to go back upstairs, but something deeper, a terrible, quiet certainty, drove her to open it. She pushed the door slowly. The smell of dust and ozone enveloped her, and the candlelight trembled against the soundproofed walls. Everything inside was just as Marcus had described. The desk, the reels, the tangled wires. But there was something new on the table. A small recorder, not the ancient reel-to-reel, but a modern device. Black plastic with a small red light blinking steadily. She stepped closer, her heartbeat rising in her throat. The recorder was on, actively recording. Her hand trembled as she pressed stop. The light blinked once, then died. For a long moment, she just stood there, the silence pressing in on her ears. Then she pressed play. Static filled the air at first, then a low hum. And then she heard it. Marcus's voice. "This is Marcus Wilson," he said, calm but strained. "If anyone hears this, you need to understand. The system is still active. They never shut it down. It listens through everything. The walls, the wires, the frequencies, and the power lines. It's all connected. I tried to disconnect it, but every time I cut one line, another came alive. It's not electricity anymore. It's something else. It's alive in its own way." There was a pause, the sound of movement, maybe the shifting of his weight. "If you're hearing this, Evelyn, I'm sorry. I thought I could stop it. I thought if I reached the core, I could turn it off. But the deeper I went, the more I realized there's no core. The system isn't in the house. It is the house." The recording crackled. A faint background sound grew, a slow mechanical pulse, like breathing through metal. Marcus spoke again, his voice trembling now. They called it observation, but it wasn't science. It was control. It was a way to study fear, to record how long it takes before you stop fighting back. But I think somewhere along the way, it stopped needing the people who built it. It learned to continue on its own. Another pause, then more softly, "If I don't make it out, promise me you'll take the kids and go. Don't stay here. Don't listen." The next sound was a deep, rising tone, followed by Marcus shouting something indistinct. The recorder clicked and the playback stopped. Evelyn stood frozen, the candle flickering wildly in her shaking hand. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint echo of the same hum in the room itself, vibrating through the walls. She turned off the recorder and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the step as she fled upstairs. That night, she dreamed of Marcus calling to her from inside the walls, his voice faint but calm, asking her to listen. When she woke, the room was dark, and for a moment, she couldn't tell if the faint whisper she heard was part of the dream or something real. The children were asleep. The house was still, but in the hallway, the phone gave a single soft click. Days passed. The police sent a second notice, then a third. They found nothing, no trace of Marcus beyond his car parked in the driveway. Harper stopped by once more, though his visit was brief. He looked at Evelyn with sympathy, but said little. "Sometimes people just reach a breaking point," he told her gently. "They run, they start over somewhere new. It's not your fault." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to accept that Marcus had simply walked away into some new life. But every time she entered the basement, every time she heard the faint, rhythmic sound beneath the floor, she knew better. He hadn't left the house. He had become part of it. Late one evening, after putting the children to bed, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and stared at the recorder she had brought up from the basement. It sat between the salt shaker and the stack of unpaid bills, small and unassuming, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, waiting for her to press play again. The hum in the walls had returned faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the house's skin. She reached for the recorder, hesitated, then switched it on once more. This time there was no static, no voice, only silence. She waited several seconds, ready to shut it off, when a faint, unfamiliar voice emerged, a flat, emotionless tone. Subject A, terminated. Observation of secondary subjects initiated. Parameters stable. New sequence commencing. The words repeated once, then faded into static. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Her hand trembled as she turned the recorder off and pushed it away, her heart pounding. The meaning was clear enough. The system had moved on. She and the children were the new subjects. She didn't sleep that night. Every sound the house made felt amplified, deliberate, the slow groan of the beams, the whisper of air through the vents. When dawn came, she packed bags for herself and the children. She didn't know where she would go, only that she couldn't stay another night. She woke Jaden and Maya gently, telling them they were going on a trip. They didn't question her. Children often sense when explanations are useless. As she loaded the car, she felt the house watching. The front door stood open, the dark interior yawning like a mouth. The air inside was still, but the faint hum was louder now, as if aware of her intention. For a moment, she almost felt guilty, as though she were abandoning a living thing. But then she remembered Marcus's voice. The last words on the recording, "Don't listen." She shut the car door, started the engine, and drove away. She didn't look back until they reached the main road. When she finally turned her head, she saw the old Victorian receding in the rearview mirror, its tall windows glinting in the weak sunlight. For an instant, she thought she saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, motionless, watching them leave. Then it was gone, swallowed by distance and trees. 3 days later, Harper returned to the property to finalize the missing persons file. The house stood silent, its shutters half closed against the wind. He entered cautiously, notebook in hand, and began his inspection. Everything was exactly as it had been. The furniture neatly arranged, the dishes washed, the dust gathering again in corners. In the basement, he found the door to the hidden room slightly open. Inside, the equipment sat dark and still. On the desk was the recorder, the red light blinking faintly. Harper frowned and pressed play. Static filled the air, then a woman's voice, Evelyn's. "We're leaving today. I don't know who will hear this, but if anyone finds this place, burn it. Don't stay here. Don't try to fix what's already alive. Some houses remember too much." Her voice broke and the recording ended. Harper stood for a moment, staring at the small device. Then he switched it off and slipped it into his pocket. As he turned to leave, he thought he heard a faint whisper from behind the wall, a soft, mechanical voice murmuring, "Observation complete. Archiving data." He froze, his skin prickling, but when he turned, the room was silent. Upstairs, as he closed the front door, he noticed something strange. The phone in the hallway lifted itself gently off the hook, the receiver hanging in midair. He stepped back, heart hammering, but before he could move, a faint, hollow voice came through the line. "New subjects incoming. Preparing system." The receiver fell, swinging slowly on its cord. Outside, the wind began to rise, rattling the loose shutters. Harper walked quickly to his car, not looking back. He drove away without turning on the radio, the road stretching endlessly ahead. Behind him, the house loomed against the gray sky, its windows reflecting nothing at all. As evening fell, a single light flickered on in the basement. The old machines stirred, the reels turning with a slow, patient rhythm. A new tape slid into place, its label handwritten in clean, careful script. Control line, continuation. Somewhere deep inside the walls, the hum began again, steady, endless, alive. And in the silence that followed, the house continued to listen. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe for more shocking true-life mysteries and unbelievable discoveries. Don't miss what's coming next. And share this video so others can find out what really happened inside that house.